Okay, good evening. It's 7:34 on Tuesday, April 2nd. I want to call this regular meeting of the Board of Finance to order. This is one of our many regular meetings that we have during the Board of Finance budget review cycle. This one we're going to be discussing primarily the Board of Ed operating capital budgets, and we'll start off the meeting as always with public comment. If anyone would like to make a public comment, if you would just come up to the dais and include your name on the sign-in sheet. Okay. Jen, have we received any indications that people want to speak via email?
No.
Okay, so we'll move beyond public comment. So the first item up is going to be to discuss the Board of Education budget, both the operating and the CapEx budgets. You know, this year a little bit different than other years. I think we've made sure sort of everyone focuses on this budget, just given the size and importance of it, and particularly this year, the year-over-year increases. I guess I would start off on this operating budget a little bit the same way we spoke about. We started off our review, or official review of the Board of Selectmen's budget, in that, you know, looking back to December, you know, close to 5 months ago, I provided, you know, on behalf of the Board of Finance, overall sort of budget guidance. That budget guidance was in part reflected on historical budgets, in part reflected and based on the overall 5-year program that we had put together, and you all were very involved in terms of planning for Great Island, the back end of Oxford School, the planning for the upcoming now $100 million renovations to the HHR elementary schools and so forth. And that guidance was in the 3 to 4% range, and that was sort of inclusive of what we all refer to as sort of core budgeting, which is effectively doing the same thing this year that we needed to do last year, and those other items that, you know, things that may have changed in terms of what we need to deliver, and then any of the types of new programs. So that budget was in the sort of 3 to 4% range, and that was, I think, December 12th. Ultimately, in early January, the superintendent presented a budget which was a tad under 6.2% on a year-over-year basis. That was 6.2% versus the 4% budget increase that we all approved the prior year. It was a 6.2% increase under effectively the same teacher contract that existed in the prior year. And it was, you know, a 6.2% increase in the budget relative to student enrollment that had, I would say, projected to decline by a handful, as it has in sort of past years. That 6.2% increase also included a number of initiatives which the superintendent and his team had went through in terms of looking at how to try to find operational efficiency, cost savings within the budget, as I believe we always should. A lot of those changes had to do with either optimizing the way they staff stuff, or, as they have done every year in the past, calibrating the number of students to the number of teachers, generally inside their guidelines. Throughout the budget process, when the Board of Ed reviewed it, there were some increases and decreases and changes, and a lot of discussion. Ultimately, it ended up at a tad under 6.5%. Included, I think, some of the recommendations that Dr. Adley and Rich and Marge and his staff had kind of worked on, and did include others that the Board of Ed had sort of, you know, very specific views on. Included some very small tweaks on the revenue side, and some other programming changes. That's a significant difference, at least in my view, the 6.5% that's ultimately in front of us tonight, and the 3 to 4% guidance that we that we gave. That guidance, again, was based on historical rates of increase. It was based on the existing contracts. It was based on the fact that over the last 10 years, the Board of Ed actual spending year over year, including things in the past, which is no longer done, things like pre-buy, had averaged under 3%, and the last few years had been in the 3.5% range. So, I mean, my view, if you look at the 6.5% in front of us and the top end of the guidance that was presented, the current budget is about $2.8 million over that. So that's what we have in front of us now. Taking that operating budget and combining it with I'd say, relatively on the low end of kind of traditional capital that they're asking for. I think we all expected that because there's been a lot of capital items that have been advanced, that had come out of the traditional budget and been moved into the HHR renovations, right? And having recently completed Oxbridge, we were at a little bit of a lower spot in terms of our regular run rate capital. But it also included, there are two other appropriations that will come before us sort of side by side and along with the existing budget, about $850,000 in connection with buying vehicles to sort of in-source some of their transportation needs, and another $1 million plus related to certain security enhancements that they're contemplating moving forward with. All in all, and we spoke about this a little bit last week, this operating budget and the Board of Ed's capital combined with the Board of Selectmen's capital and operating budget, before using any money in our general fund, would put the average taxpayer's dollars that they're asked to pay each year up over 10%. In my view, that's just completely unacceptable, not something I would propose putting forward to the taxpayer. Now, we do have an excess of cash in our general fund. That's previous tax dollars. Once the use, those dollars don't exist anymore. And we do, I think on the town side, have a couple $1 million worth of projected surpluses, both sort of greater revenue, thanks to good work in our treasurer's office, and some lower expenses in some of the town departments, which we can use. But again, those are all sort of previous tax dollars. Once used, they don't necessarily exist anymore. So as we went through the first half of the departments and so forth on the Board of Selectmen side, I think we should be doing the same on the Board of Ed side and making sure that these budgets, when combined together, don't put us anywhere near a 10% increase. So I'll pause there if anyone else would like to make any statements.
Well, I'll just add to that over the last 5 years, if you take out the COVID year, the average increase in the collective budget is 3.5%. There have been a couple of 2s, there have been a couple of 4s, but nothing in excess of 4.1%. That's the aggregate budget year-over-year increase. And through unassigned fund balance or bonding or other tools at our disposal, we've been able to manage the actual increase in the mill rate to no more than just over 3% and generally under 3%. So that's kind of our recent history. And certainly I share your perspective, and that's a history that I would like to maintain. That behavior, that pattern of tax increases in that range is something that I personally strive for. And so we've got a lot of work to do to reconcile that objective with where we are with the proposed budgets.
Any others?
For me, I think you guys have echoed it well. It's hard for me to look at colleagues in town and neighbors and say 10%, especially after rebound. So I'd prefer that number to be lower, much lower, almost to a historical number that you, Dan, just talked about. I've always kind of thought about our budget should be somewhere, not just Board of Education, but somewhere between 2.5% to 3.5%. And I'd like to go try to get to that number when we're all said and done.
We'd like to have low tax rates, but we'd like to have good services. We bought Great Island for $85 million. I signed off on it. We want to keep good schools. This increase is in line with neighboring towns, and I get the same feedback when I'm sitting in Rich's seat, which I did last week. But we have structural problems in that healthcare is increasing faster than the budget increases. In my town, the healthcare has risen from 13.5% of the budget to 18.5% of the budget. It's a structural problem, not only in schools, but in all other organizations. We have to find a way to address it. I think they've done a good job in addressing it with the high deductible health plan, and I believe that we should analyze the budget, but ultimately, it's the taxpayer's decision. And through the RTM, make that decision.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the calculations of the impact on the average taxpayer, learning how much excess cash we actually have in the general fund after the change in the ratings methodology that Moody's implemented this last time around, and seeing where the surpluses actually come out to see how much is there. I would say that given the rate of increase in budgets, the Board of Selectmen operating alone budget is up 8%. And if we are going to ask the Board of Ed to go find some money to move back towards your guidance number, whatever number we ask the Board of Ed to get to, I think is appropriate for us to ask the Board of Selectmen to get to the same number.
Well, I think just to be clear, at the point in the process we're at now, right? I mean, this isn't us going back and asking the Board of Ed, like, hey, do you want to take another look? Right? I think ultimately it's our responsibility as like the 7 elected members of the Board of Finance to make a decision around what we think is an appropriate budget, package that together, as David said, with the Board of Selectmen, capital, debt service, cash on funds, and set a mill rate that we all believe in and I think is responsible to push down to the RTM for their ultimate approval, because they are the ultimate the last appropriating body. You know, one of the comments I'll make, you know, Paul, and I think you bring up a good point. We purchased Great Island for $85 million and amortized that over 30 years. We're investing $101.45 million in the renovation of 3 elementary schools and just shy of $60 million in a new one. Oxbridge.
Yeah, so that's 160 between the 4 schools.
Yeah. And because we have historically kept tight operating budgets, analyzed, reanalyzed, looked for efficiencies, made sure that we're investing in the services that are most valuable to our constituents and so forth, keeping those tax increases ultimately in the sort of 2 to 3% range is actually what allowed us to build 1 new school, renovate three of our elementary schools, purchase an island, expand our open space, and deal with flooding projects and others.
And maintain a AAA bond rating because of the efficiency of our financials.
Yeah. And, you know, as I thought I stated pretty clearly in the state of the town, at least my view is we're supposed to have a portfolio of assets here in town. We're supposed to have great schools, which I've only been here for 20 years. In the 20 years I've been here, they've always been great. We're supposed to have, I think, great services. I think we're supposed to have open space, low taxes. It's supposed to be a portfolio of everything. And I do think, you know, education's important. It's not the only thing. And I do believe that we can have great schools, great services, great assets and so forth, and be fiscally responsible in terms of how we create budgets and deliver services. And, you know, I'll applaud again Dr. Adley and his staff for their digging through, bringing a consultant in, looking for efficiencies, moving things around, recommending reductions in FTEs, which I would like to change the talk track. There's this notion of cuts or firing. When you have 10 to 14% turnover per year, small reductions in FTEs are easily handleable. Can easily be handled through attrition, through natural attrition. And I think the work, albeit came a little bit late in the process, that Rich led around the reinventing, if you will, some of our transportation needs on part of our transportation. I think that was done, sort of on the fly, came over expenses, reanalyzed it. We had a few questions, went back, sort of redesigned it, more savings and so forth. I think that's the way we're supposed to be looking at everything, from school buses to staffing to all of the activities we deliver in school. I think that needs to be a sort of ingrained in the way that we all do take our responsibilities here.
Jim, excuse my squeaky voice again, but everything that you've said is frankly motherhood and apple pie. It's the goal that every town government should have for the people that live there and so on. What I think we need is a way to span this difference between where you say we are and indeed where the Board of Education and the Board of Selectmen is. And how do we get from here to there?
Well, I think in terms of reducing budgets, I always think they're best reduced by the actual operating boards, right? We're not, our job is not to schedule the classes, choose the languages, set the class size policy and so forth. We're here to set the overall sort of economics, if you will, of the budget and how that ends up being constructed into the mill rate that we deliver. I think it's ultimately the administration and the Board of Ed who set the initiatives and set the priorities. I mean, I have no doubt everything in the budget and all of the services we deliver are valuable. But at some point, some have to be more valuable than others. And in a world where there are significant demands, and while we have strong resources, we don't have infinite resources. I think there needs to be a discussion around that. I think it's supposed to be at the Board of Ed level, and ultimately whatever changes we make to the budget, it goes to the RTM, and ultimately, as we did, I think 3 years ago, the Board of Ed works with its staff to readjust the budget.
I think that's exactly right, but I would like to ask one thing. Thank you very much for sending around that article in Norwalk today, because they found themselves in a not dissimilar situation to where we find ourselves. And one of the solutions that they chose was to phase in the revaluation. Is that a Board of Finance decision, or is that a Board of Selectmen decision, or is that something that we would consider?
I think what David's referring to, I think Stanford did a similar thing. I spoke a lot about the revaluation year, right? While I said everyone's homes are up, residential properties are up on average kind of 28 to 29%. The overall grand list itself is up a little bit less than 25%. That's because commercial properties, which effectively get revalued every year through the income approach, only saw 1 year of increase, and all of our homes saw 5 years worth of increases. So that shifted a little bit of the tax burden from the residential properties. From the commercial properties to the residential, a couple percent, small, and that's why when I say if there's like a 8% increase in taxes, residential properties will take a little bit more, commercial properties will take a little bit less. Personally, I think that that sort of unfairly treats one property owner versus another, and so forth. Stanford saw massive swings, as did Norwalk, just given the amount of sort of commercial property that they have relative to residential property. I think it's I think it's per state law. Jen may correct me. I think it's always permissible. We need to kind of check our charter, but that's not necessarily, to me, that's just, we're just moving dollars from one pocket to another. We're not actually addressing the spending issue. It's a little bit like when I think about, whether it's beach passes or participation fees. It's whether residents are just paying out of the right pocket or left pocket. It's not necessarily addressing, the significant spending increases we're seeing. So, in terms of, again, it is not our job to go back and say, subtract 2 computers, add 1 teacher, and, and dim the lights. That's not our job to do. That's the Board of Ed's job and administration's job. I think in listening to their debates, things that I'll tell you, like I've reflected on, are, there was real discussion around, inside a many variable equation, re-optimizing the staffing levels, or I should say, I think teaching levels is the right word, to students in the middle school. You all saw, like in the back, I think the very back of our budget books, an analysis that the consultant had done. Ultimately, the Board of Ed, the 9 members chose, or the board as a whole, their budget reflects sort of not making the superintendent's proposed changes, but I think it's, I think if I listen to what Dr. Adley said correctly, those changes are likely still prudent to move through, and so there may already be some surpluses that are baked into the budget. And those are hundreds of thousands of dollars.
To be clear, on the Board of Selectmen side, we don't have the luxury of just saying, here's the number, you have to get to it. We actually go line item by line item. So back to John's original question, to the Board of Education, we said you have to, your budget needs to be reduced by, if it's reduced by a number. The Board of Selectmen, we actually have to identify where it's reduced.
Yeah.
And vote to make those modifications.
Yeah. Now, the Board of Selectmen budget, just to remind everybody on the operating side, that includes all debt service, whether it be town projects or school projects, which technically are town assets, but all of that debt service is inside of theirs. And the Board of Selectmen budget includes a fairly substantial revenue aspect that we don't necessarily all put together inside the budget. So when you begin to compile those together and maybe decouple the debt service, you kind of drill down into the actual operating budget. But by charter, the way that we vote on it, it's inclusive of all the debt service.
So I appreciate what Dan said, and it's exactly right. What are the next steps? Where do we go from here?
So, I mean, I've listened, countless dog walks to the many, many, many hours of I feel like I hear Jill's voice like in my ear all the time talking here, but I've listened to all those budget meetings. There were a lot of things that I saw discussed, even when I was looking at the ad cut list, right? That various individual board members proposed, right? And I'm going to ignore some of the ones that were just absolutely silly, right? So those don't even deserve, I think, to be brought up here, right? But I think when I look through those, there were a lot of, I think, thoughtful changes that were proposed there that I'm confident that the group of 9 of them working with their staff could go back and find significant savings. Can it get all the way down to 4%? I think the answer is yes, because they have to. The question is, as we had, if you all remember, it was literally 4 years ago this week that we were faced with COVID, or what we all called like Corona at the time, and we needed to go back and we needed to make changes. And ultimately, there was well over $1 million worth of changes that were made that I don't even think students, or frankly teachers, would even know about. Now mind you, there were things inside the budget at that time, like budget control, things like turnover. There were some other things that, to give Rich credit again, and Dr. Adley, they went through and sort of took a lot of that out, right? But ultimately, we're in the people business, right? And so one of the things that the board discussed, right? They have class size policies. Like when I think about the levers that they can pull, they have class size policies. I think lower class size is probably always better than larger class size. But there needs to be some optimization in there. And I think, they have the changes that were proposed at Middlesex, for example, were because they were on the very low end of their class size policy. Again, it's not as simple as taking kids, dividing by class policy, and voila. Like there are different subjects, there are different grades, there are different teams, and so forth. But those are levers that I'm sure that they would need to sort of look at. Other things that were discussed, I would say, just looking at the cut list. Were, I'll loosely say sort of administration, how and what is handled by, I call it the senior administration, the sort of middle administration, and then what is handled by teachers. I think there was a lot of discussion around that, and I think, whether it be, again, these are just things that, again, we're on the ad cut list, whether it's the old model of I think Dr. Brenner used to refer to as kind of teacher leader model, or whether it's the sort of department head model, or even things in between, which we had a number of years ago. Those are all things that were sort of discussed, none of which are easy decisions, but I think those are things that need to, I expect that they would probably look at.
Can I ask our resident historian for some perspective for a second? Jack, Dan said that the Board of Finance has the responsibility to make line item cuts for the Board of Selectmen budget. Is that your understanding as well? That seems inconsistent that we would tell the operating departments of the town what they have to cut, but we don't tell the Board of Ed what they have to cut.
We don't actually, just to be clear.
That seems inconsistent to me.
Just before Jack starts,
trying to figure out.
What I would just say is, we don't actually tell department head what to cut. There are just, if you will, in the Board of Selectmen budget, there are 1,000 line items in the spreadsheet. We can decrease certain line items. We have to decrease certain line items in there, as opposed to the Board of Ed, they have, 4 inches of line items. We just only make a single appropriation, which they can use throughout the year to do however they want.
But that's still inconsistent.
It is, but
It is.
but that's the way. That's the
I'm
way
going to give you
it's-
the legal
That's
opinion.
statutory?
It's statutory.
It's statutory.
So, Jack Davis, 197 Hoyt Street, and I'm going to bring Jim back a little bit to his last year as chair of F&B. F&B attempted to do exactly what you said, which was to reduce, that's right, Rob, you were there, to reduce the Board of Selectmen budget by a single dollar amount and allow the Board of Selectmen to then make that determination. And we stood there offering several alternatives, having looked at the budget, and Wayne Fox sat there and read chapter and verse to us that we are not allowed to do that on the Board of Selectmen. On the Board of Selectmen, we have to do line item. So it's, regardless, there's a lot of things in town to me that just don't make sense. That may be one of them. And I know that I've had conversations with Kate over the years that if we were to reduce the Board of Selectmen budget, I would love to be able to say, okay, we want to reduce it by 200,000. You, town administrator and Board of Selectmen, you guys figure out where you're going to take it better than us, which is also, by the way, if you go into the RTM, well, somebody doesn't want to take it from Park and Rec because they like Park and Rec, and somebody doesn't want to take it from Public Works because they like Public Works. And so it would be much easier to say, here's 200,000, come back and tell us what you're adjusting in the budget. We're not allowed to.
Jack, is that by town charter or Connecticut general statute?
That is beyond my pay grade. I can't answer which, but I believe that Wayne was reading from the charter itself.
Yeah, I think it's both.
Yeah,
But it may be both.
I think it's Connecticut too.
Yeah, I can't answer the Connecticut, but I know that it was definitely within our...
And we're precluded, to extend that, we're precluded from doing anything with the Board of Education other than giving them a single number.
That's correct.
Well, that is correct. So since we approve a total appropriation, I mean, it's very important to realize, and I have several new people, and I forgot to mention it this year. While the towns elect, and Paul, you can correct me and say it better than I can, while the towns elect Board of Ed boards, their authority comes from the State Department of Education, not the town.
It's mixed.
So-
We're a dual agency.
Well, okay,
Or do.
that's even better. So the fact of the matter is, we give them a total appropriation, and what I like to say is that white book over there has a lot of placeholders in it, and they're really helpful, and they will move during the course of the year, but for the most part, I'm always impressed that something that thick actually ends up being reasonably accurate. Sorry, year after year, I'm saying, oh, that's pretty good. So that the best thing we can do is determine, you know, and it's something we did last night at F&B, we had this similar discussion. If the guidance isn't 3.5% or 4%, what did we believe the guidance should be based upon the drivers? Okay, here's the guidance, here's a percentage, and this is what I shared with the board earlier today. So if you like this percent, based upon the budget that was approved by the Board of Ed, this is what the reduction would be. If you like this number, this is what the reduction would be. If you don't like any of the numbers, keep it the way they are. But while I'm up here, there's one other thing I want to add. It's not just what the Board of Ed put on the table on their cut list. There's things that weren't discussed on that cut list that have no effect on education. The most popular one I'm going to mention is there's $150,000 of Darien High School desks that was moved, which should have been operating, was moved to capital and then back to operating. You don't need 1,000 desks representing 2/3 in this budget year. There's other things that I said a little bit with tongue-in-cheek, but our uniforms are not in shatters. We're not sending kids out in rags. So if you were to take the replacement for uniforms and move the whole schedule back a year, year one becomes year two and vice versa, other than the hygienic ones, that's an opportunity. There's an opportunity, do we really need this year to buy whatever technology we're buying? And so those are the things that I hate to get into it because that's micromanaging, and I don't like micromanaging the Board of Ed. But those are just like areas that they can look at, and they have a better understanding of the budget than and I have a pretty good understanding of that book and where things are in it. But even with that, for the operations, they're going to understand their district and their school system better than any of us up here, maybe with the exception of Paul. But the fact of the matter is, so what Jim said is absolutely right.
Okay, so I guess I would say two things, one is, this is my 18th budget year, and I don't think there's ever been a question that anyone on this board or the board of the RTM has had regarding something on the Board of Ed budget, whether it's a question or an idea, that when put to the Board of Ed, they didn't come back to us with an answer on. Provide data, time, phone calls, everything. So there's always been maybe absent one time, but they've always come back with whatever information like we've needed, right? So I think I think we have a great sort of working relationship there, but ultimately it's not our job to decide sort of the what. Our question is only the how much. And I'd say that's like with two caveats on capital, right? The capital, because I say like the schools, the furnaces, the school buses, those are all like belong to the town, and they're, we give the keys to Dr. Adley and Rich and so forth to use them, but because it's capital, we have sort of line item, if you will, veto on that. And I think the school bus appropriation that's before us, and we're going to talk about in connection with this overall budget, because it's got to be paid for with either new tax dollars or old tax dollars, so it's kind of part of the overall decision. Came back with a lot of questions there. Rich may have questioned whether or not I used to be a school bus driver, but he came back with answers on all of these. I think rethought it, looked at new assets, and I think there's a good sort of working relationship that we've always had there. But when it comes to the operating budget, it's ultimately the Board of Ed's decision. We have to decide how much, and then they take, and as I've always seen, allocate it to those things which they think are the highest value and continue to allow us to drive the same results that we have year after year. And just one thing to remind everyone, no one's talking about a cut to the budget. We're talking about, this was last year's budget. The new budget is a tad under $8 million higher than the last budget. And so the question is whether the next budget is going to be 8 million more, 7 million more, 6 million more, 5 million more. It's not, no one's talking about giving them less money, or at least no one that that's had a conversation with me about giving them less money than they had last year, right?
I remember well, that 4 years ago when you guys were fresh on the job and we were asking you to cut $1 million, and I remember how hard that was, and emotionally hard for everybody, right? And I remember us telling you, we're going to be there for you if you need money. Like if you come back and you say we don't have enough and it's something that you really need to have, of course we're here for you. And we really appreciated that you went and did that work and came up with the cuts, and everything did work out great. That was awesome work, and I know that since then you've gotten, particularly you, Rich, and I appreciate it, so much more efficient, and I love what you've done, and your reporting is so much more transparent. I'm far less involved in the line items than I used to be because I trust you. Like, you're doing a really great job. And I know that's going to make it even harder to find additional savings. But guidance is important and very critically important this year with numbers as big as they are for the taxpayer impact. And unfortunately, I think we're going to have to rely on you guys to go back and try to be more creative. I get it, you guys are mandated to find or to deliver the best education that you can to our kids, and I'm grateful for that with 4 kids in the system, that's for sure. And I know that doesn't always come with, the little bird on your shoulder saying, well, what about the budget? And maybe that's, more our role this time than ever to say, what about the budget? We got to go back and be more creative. And I just want to thank you in advance for your partnership throughout all of this. And I hope we can come up with ways to deliver the exceptional education we have for so long on a little bit less of an increase.
You were talking about 4 years ago. I think it's a really good example. And for historical purposes, people remember we were trying to get to a zero budget. Middle of COVID, I think there was 11% unemployment rate in just Darien, if you guys remember, and it was our goal to kind of drive to zero. And to your point, I think we asked for $1 million in cuts. And one of the things I learned then, and I'll learn now, is you guys are the operators, right? You guys know, you guys live this every single day. It's not us, right? So, and I don't want to be in that business, to be honest with you. You talk about the size of the book. You're exactly right, Jack. Right? It's huge. I never want to step on anybody's toes. You guys know it better than we do. I think this just becomes, can we manage the number down a little bit? And I think that's all we're asking.
But to get to the number that's been put before us to 4%, you have to have the $2 to $2.5 million cut. That far exceeds the $1 million we requested before. My question is, where are you going to cut it without hurting the overall efficiency of the system?
What was the budget 4 years ago?
Excuse me?
What was the budget 4 years ago? How much was the budget 4 years ago?
I don't remember.
Probably 15
Look in your
to
book.
18 million higher than it is now.
And that budget was
Well, it's
100,
up less.
was 102,
Yeah,
and now it's
3%.
122.
It's up,
Right, so
it
there's
grows
like
3% a
20
year,
million.
right? It grows 3% a year. So
Yeah.
just do the
Yeah.
math.
But if you can do that math in your head, I'm impressed.
Well then, sorry to disappoint you.
I can't do it.
So, I mean, other things that, you know, I've looked at and I've listened and I've followed throughout the budget seasons are technology, right? And how we actually deploy technology across our staff. And, you know, at least in the sub-high school, you know, our students and so forth, right? I think rethinking how much our staff, our 500-600 plus of teachers, using all the technology we give to them. Is everybody walking around with their laptop and iPad and desktop and others, drilling down into, like, looking for efficiencies there is something that I've, you know, been a fan of. Things that don't directly touch students, and having had the opportunity to actually guest teach a couple classes, I've got a little bit of an insight in terms of how some of this technology is used and so forth. I'd like to see all of that the same way my laptop at work is viewed, how many hours I spend on it and how much I use it. And if I ask for a new one, it's like, well, you haven't been using that, you're not gonna get a new one. Or you can wait another year. I'd like to really start to think about how we can get the most efficiency, really think about sort of how we're investing in, I mean, this sits in the operating budget, but it's kind of more capital related. Those, I think that's just a single example of things that I would like to see reviewed each year, every year, and have sort of KPIs where we decide and whether we want to allocate that last dollar within the Board of Ed budget to a new iPad or to, you know, a class size of 20 versus 19. But
Since others are giving guidance ideas, I noticed that there were two different suggestions for revenue enhancement, both around participation fees. Mr. Sini's came in, I think, if I recall correctly, around $400,000. And Mr. Mulroney, with his 70-30 split, came in a little over $900,000. I know that we have never done that before, and I know that it's arduous to ask parents to do that, but maybe that's something that needs to be revisited in some capacity. As opposed to making a cut to something that might more directly affect the educational experience.
I think a lot of those things are great, and a lot of the things when I look through the ad cut list that were brought up, again, I think all have like potential for either improving services or decreasing expenses. My sense is they're very hard to enact inside of like a 32 day sprint, even for Rich and Dr. Adley. And I think a lot of that stuff, I know that every year they've spent time, over the summer looking at these things, but a lot of these things that I know you all discuss that kind of keep coming up around each budget time, and then sometimes occupy, a lot of your and your staff's work on that. Maybe because it is part of the operating budget and kind of reflect on the information you came back to us on the transportation. It sounds like you all are considering moving forward with a sort of defined contribution plan for the new, is it safe to say, like all the new transportation staff?
So anybody, excuse me, anybody who's a non-affiliated employee, so yes, so the drivers and the assistant.
Got it. And I think, I know, like, from our side, the defined benefit versus the defined contribution is something we've been looking to bring our new employee partners, whether they're on the Board of Ed side, on your team, or on the, or working with us on the town side, bringing some of our new employee partners into this, I think has been, it doesn't always, at least my view is it doesn't necessarily move the needle too much today, but I think when hopefully my kids have the opportunity to, and we think about sort of longer term pension costs and so forth, I think it's sort of prudent planning that the next 7 members of this board that are sitting here 15 years from now will hopefully look back and on all of us and say they were good moves. And I guess maybe on that special appropriation, one of the things at least I've recommended to the board here is when we're considering your operating budget, your capital budget, which is now sort of inside a singular capital budget, and the 2 appropriations all together. And maybe just for the public to make sure everyone knows, ultimately we have a finite amount of dollars we could use from the general fund and or like surpluses that'll come back. So, and given some of the new rating agency guidance, as we're planning here, we need to, whether it's a special appropriation or a traditional fiscal appropriation, we need to kind of plan what we're going to be taking out of the general fund. So I think school buses and or some of the Sprinter assets you're talking about wouldn't be something we would bond for. So these are things as we think about the totality of the spending in front of us. When we're talking about starting off at 10%, that includes security, some of the security initiatives that you all are working on, and the bus appropriations. On that point, Rich, maybe a question. I know the appropriation that came to us was around $850. It sounded like with changing some of the assets to the Sprinter, that was getting down closer to around $750. But you weren't sure because you won't know until you actually go out to bid?
So it's correct. So we did get a quote from a dealership for the Sprinters, and they were a little over $71,000. So assuming those quotes hold, the totality of it would be about $751,000. We did issue a bid for them actually yesterday, with the caveat that if it doesn't get approved, we can not award to anybody. So the hope is that we would get those responses back by the end of April. Without question, the Sprinter van is going to be less than a Type 2. Yeah. It's just a matter of where it ends up coming.
Who are you asking to bid? Is it various dealers with different
dealerships? Yeah.
But not just. And you said this, right? It's not Mercedes, not just
no.
Mercedes.
So the quote we got was for Mercedes because they were the only ones who got back to us at that time. So Mercedes has them. Ford has what's called the Ford Transit. They have them as well. So we've been reaching out to Ford dealerships. We've been reaching out to Mercedes dealerships. Dodge has a Dodge Ram, though we're not sure whether or not they'd be able to do 15 passengers versus 12. So the bid is for any Sprinter van that can seat 15.
So is your understanding that a Ford 15-passenger van is more in the mid-50s versus the low 70s, kind of list price without any options?
So it seemed like
it
seemed like it was more in like the mid-60s as opposed to the low 50s. Okay. If you're getting a 15-passenger.
But should they talk delivery times? Is there like a...
So the bid requires them to be able to have them by on premise by August.
By August?
So the Mercedes dealership that we did get the quote from, they have them available and ready to go. We did reached out to a Ford dealership in Westchester. They did not have 3, but they had 1 on the lot ready to go, so it might be that you kind of piecemeal them between different dealerships.
So just to be clear for people that don't understand it, I think this board does, but instead of 5 Type 2s, there'd be 2 Type 2 buses and 3 Sprinter vans.
Correct.
So that's what we're talking about. Right.
I think one of the things, Dan and I spoke about was in terms of pushing this through, just because every dollar that we approve ultimately will, whether it comes out of the general fund or is appropriated from future tax dollars, it affects the mill rate. So if it's pointing towards 750, one of the options we have is approving 750 rather than 850, and then we have a few $100,000 in our sort of pre-appropriated, I think is the right word, capital reserve, which the 7 of us can immediately appropriate. So it's something that I'd encourage our board to think about as we're,
Yeah, just a point of clarification on that. When we have surpluses at the end of the year, it's a lot better than deficits, but that means we've overtaxed our taxpayers because we're returning money from budgets that we've already taxed for or set a tax rate for. So we'd prefer not to authorize spending where it might be higher than needed. And if we have more on a fiscal budget, that's one thing. It's hard to predict, book this thick, et cetera, et cetera. But on something like this, where maybe the line of sight's a little bit more visible, maybe it'd be better to be a little bit more precise on the front end.
So you guys, Jim, then you're saying you have the ability to meet at the end of April when our bids come in, if there's any discrepancy, so that we could make sure we could.
Yeah, if we were to appropriate 750 and it came in at 800,
Mm-hmm.
our board, assuming nothing like material changes in the next month, would have money that is pre-appropriated, that's sort of previously appropriated dollars that we could then, just this board could approve to move over, unless Jen is shaking her head back there.
I am not.
Okay.
Yeah, but Jack is saying, if you appropriate 750 and you come in at 800, it will not be brought before the RTM, because we know that it's over, and therefore they're not authorized to spend the 800,000. So if they do, and we're meeting on the 29th, that would require the Board of Finance to have a special meeting to approve the higher amount.
Yeah, but the long story is we'd prefer not to budget like a dollar more than we really need, particularly if we have a couple extra $100,000 in reserves. So just a kind of heads up on that.
Rich, the state came out with a revision to the ECR earlier this week. Have you had a chance to evaluate what the effects will be on this current year's budget or next year's budget?
So initially it was 68%, as I'm sure you know, and they came out today at 66.7%.
Okay.
So that's a loss in this year of about $53,000.
Okay. But you feel okay for next year?
We budgeted 75 for next year. We will probably make a recommendation to the board that we should be closer to 70.
And we're supposed to get 85, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
66.5, Rich?
66.7.
This year?
This year.
Wow.
Yeah.
It really dropped it, huh?
They saw the largest, so the state indicated to us, they saw the largest increase of submissions they have in the longest time.
And Rich, is that 66%, is that baked into your current projected deficit around 200?
So the forecast we gave the Board of Ed previously had a 68% reimbursement, and so that was a deficit of about 160,000, so this would bring it to about 210.
Okay.
And then going into fiscal year 25, you're estimating that to be worth about what?
So if you brought from 75 down to 70, that's another $180,000.
Again, that's not a change to the dollars that the state has appropriated for this fund, it's to the submissions, like the denominator.
Correct, so they haven't appropriated more funds. It's all the submissions throughout all the communities, and then it typically is more than what is appropriated at the state level, and then they take a haircut across all the communities.
Okay.
So it's got a whole lot of submissions.
Yeah.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Are there any other grants that you guys are looking at?
180,
Whether
it came in at 260,000 million, excuse me. They had 180 I believe it was 180
Yep.
budgeted by the state. The claims were 260 million.
Do you want to discuss some of the other capital items? There were not a lot, but
Capital items?
Yeah.
So, Rob, if you want to chime in, but the overall capital budget was 1.47 million. I think it was modestly down year over year. The Board of Education did reduce the superintendent's proposed budget on that by about 400, just shy of 400, but 150 of that was moving the desks into the operating budget. So, I mean, there's a litany of items here. There's, I don't think we need to go through all of these. There's 90,000 for library carpet replacement, 41,000 for library furniture, 25,000 for repair foundation leak at library. I think that, is that 25 or 75? Can't read my own hand.
I believe it's 25.
25. Older school radios, radio replacement cycle, 58,000. Operable wall replacement system, 65,000. Pit mats at the pole vault, 22,000. The chimney at the middle school, 81,000 to repair, repairs to north facade. Door closers, 47,000. Basically, increased classrooms that are chilled through this chiller, that's 80,000. Replace an oil tank monitoring system at the middle school, that's 33,000. And then there's 28,000 for a snow thrower at Ox Ridge because the sidewalks are more significant than they were before. And then 10,000 at to repair oil tank monitoring system at Tokenique. There are really two. I mean, not that those are insignificant, but there are two that are in the hundreds of thousands. The first is 389,000 for phase 2 of the. Remember, we approved the theater lighting design, and we approved it in phases. So this is phase 2. This would be 389,000. It's really mostly lighting, both in the booth and the stage, and some drapery, and then and so personally, I'm fine with all of that. The one thing that I did want to take a pause on, perhaps, is the 310,000 to repave the asphalt bus loop and parking lot at Tokenique. I've taken a look at it, and I mean, at some point it will need it, but the question is whether it really needs it now. I mean, it's always nice to have that kind of, to have a repaved road, a repaved parking lot, but it didn't seem to be, for example, I've also looked at the Nature Center driveway and parking lot, and that is in disrepair. I mean, there are potholes, et cetera. I didn't get the same sense of the level of disrepair here was not anywhere close to what it was at the Nature Center. So I don't have an opinion on this yet, but I'd ask maybe the board and maybe the administration to think about whether this could be deferred a year or two in light of the other pressures that we have. Because even though this doesn't attack the operating budget, as Jim said, every dollar is a dollar, and it's got to be funded somewhere. We typically don't. Well, I don't know if this would be eligible for bonding or not, but even if it were, we're kind of keeping a close eye on all of these items, whether it's bondable, yeah, unassigned fund balance, or taxes. Those are kind of the tools we have. So I'll just stop there.
No, it's really good, Dan, thanks. On the Tokenique asphalt that you talked about, with the repair of the buildings, that's not in there, is it? So as part of the rebuild of the
HHR?
schools? Yeah.
There's some paving in there, not all.
Is it for Tokenique, or is it?
Oh, no, Tokenique is not in HHR.
I just wanted to make sure there was no, like, I know you guys thought of it, but we just throw it out there just in case.
Yeah.
I should have a better answer for you in terms of how much at our next meeting, because I emailed Travis, our architect, to ask specifically how much of the parking lots at each of the HHR schools are
Okay,
gonna
cool.
get done.
And there's zero spending at HHR in this capital budget, of those 3 schools.
Jim and Dan, just as a matter of process, we don't meet, so the board can't necessarily contemplate and answer you on whether it's deferrable. Are you asking for a response from administration? Is that really what you want? I mean, we're not going to recommend deferring it. Just
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm asking for.
Yep.
what would be the impact of deferring it?
Yes.
I think what I'd like to know is, Dr. Adelaide and Rich, is this something that is more scheduled, right? Like for example, like kind of painting some of the paddle courts. Is this just like this was kind of coming up this year, this was in a 5-year, or this is, you know, we're damaging our suspension by driving around in the parking lot?
I mean, it's more, I would say, scheduled than it is that, you know, cars are getting damaged and whatnot. I mean, it's in disrepair and it's similar shape to what the middle school was when we paved that a few years ago. I did provide a response to a question. When we did budget this, oil prices were much higher, and obviously oil prices determine the cost of paving. So while, you know, it's not guaranteed oil prices would continue at the level they're at now into the summer, it's reasonable to assume that amount will probably be about 10 to 15% less than the 310.
Right, so I asked how was the estimate arrived at, so Rich just went through that. But I did not ask him whether this could be deferred, so.
I think there's some curb that needs to be replaced also, in addition to the tarmac.
Just out of curiosity, do you guys at least check with Ed Gentile in terms, okay, so you at least give him a quick, hey,
So
we're doing
usually-
this project and here's the price we're getting, what do you think?
So usually, like when we paved the middle school the last time, we asked them what they, you know, what their price points would be based on what they were paving. And that year, we were actually able to get a lower price point than the town, because the town was doing so much, and we basically got somebody less, but usually that's the first stop we do.
Okay, fantastic, thank you.
I think whenever we can do bulk pricing, you know, negotiate stuff together, I think that's helpful. I think 2 meetings ago, I think they mentioned that the same company that does one doesn't necessarily do the other because it's big straight shots. But,
Right, road paving and these
Yeah.
driveways and parking lots are different, yes.
Yeah. I think while we're on capital, Dan and I, now with the help of Jen and Kate and the team, have been working towards a sort of more global town-wide capital planning budget to sort of understand everything that's out there, things that are sort of over, you know, I don't know that we have a minimum yet, but things sort of over like 500,000-ish, whether it's a sewer project, whether it's a paving project, whether it's a security, whether it's other types of things, to try to get a handle and cadence on when things can be staged. Because I think, as you know, many have brought up, including our partners on the F&B committee, you know, while we were, you know, bonding a number of items when interest rates were near zero, token equals bonded at like 1.45% arbitrage yield, and our debt was so low. Now that it's higher, we're looking to come back to kind of, you know, paying, you know, current taxes for some of these things. So we need to think about sort of how they flow into our budgets and what the demand would be on our general fund. So I think we will ask you guys to, I think we're all 90% done with the format and some of the town stuff. So then we'll send it over to you to kind of have you correct some of our numbers and add where we're missing. Any other questions around the Board of Ed budget?
No.
And I'll just maybe one clarification, the increase to the budget between what, Dr. Adley proposed and what the Board of Ed ultimately approved, that $335,000, is that net of all of the savings that we think, the operating savings we expect to get on the transportation initiative? And how much are those operating savings?
So it was 407, but it doesn't include the contribution for the 401A. So you'd have to add in another, 22,000, I think it was, for the 401A. So a little less than 400.
Got it. And on that, that would be the same, I think, as we have like our partners at the SSOs and the other townwide programs.
5%.
5%, 5-year?
Yes.
So effectively, without that, it would have been increased close to 800,000, right?
What would have been increased by 800,000?
The board sort of moved it up by effectively 800,000, and then Rich's transportation initiative kind of moved it down by 400 and change. So that's why the net increase from Dr. Adley's to our Board of Eds was about 335.
Yeah.
Jim, just to remember, of that 135 and the 800, and I keep on coming back to this thing, 150,000 of it are the desks that were moved from capital into operating.
Yep. Okay. So that's it for the Board of Ed discussion. Next is, so just finishing up on that, I think we should all take and reflect on these comments now that the overall budget is beginning to kind of take effect. We're gonna discuss the second half, if you will, of the Board of Selectmen's budget and some of their related capital, and dig into revenues a little bit deeper next week. But we need to start formulating an opinion, and we'll probably have some of that discussion at the end of our next meeting in terms of where we're heading, because traditionally, by the end of Thursday, I think we want to have a direction in terms of where we're pointing, so Jen can spend the weekend updating the spreadsheet, and we can be ready to go on Tuesday.
And Jen, I know you're hiding back there somewhere. You sent one late last week, early this week? Like a new...
last week, but I'm finishing up the projection with the March numbers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping to send that out tomorrow with some additional tabs in there and some additional information.
Super, thank you.
Yeah, and just as we're talking about fund balance, Rich, are there any existing sort of capital projects that you're at the end of or ready to close out in connection with us?
So none with significant balances. Excuse me, the auditorium is about to close out, but that's less than $1,000 remaining. The security work is about to close out, and that's, again, not significant balances.
Will we ever hear about final reimbursement for the 2 roof projects?
Oh, you have heard, yes, that was part of the HHR legislative submission. So that is going to be part of that.
So we'll be able to close out those 2
Correct.
items? Okay. Sorry. I just keep seeing it every month. This has been around a long time.
That's part of the bill, so we're good.
Excellent.
Okay, so the next item is going to be a bonding update. Yes, Jen, do you want to?
Sure.
Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Chairman, after this, will you be talking about any other capital projects regarding the Board of Ed or anything?
No, nothing else. I think on the security, I think we'll probably discuss that at a future meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bonding update, we are on track for a sale on Tuesday. So we plan to, it'll be by bid, that'll be at 11 o'clock. So we'll very quickly have our results, and then Mark will be able to confirm and verify their numbers and provide us with our exact debt service number on the new issues that we can work into the budget. He did rerun his pro forma the end of last week. He had some good comps. New Canaan did a sale, a couple other comparable communities did a sale. Rates are down a little bit from what he was initially projecting, which was already about a little bit lower than what we had in the budget. So if the rates hold, we should have a small cut to debt service compared to what's in the proposed budget.
And I think, Jen, his updated numbers, I think even reflected some of the more premium coupons in the front and so forth. So even with those adjustments to the 5s up front,
Yep.
we'll have a little bit lower debt service.
Yep, if everything holds from what it was last week.
Okay. And then, Jen, maybe just for the board's benefit, as we think about sizing, you know, just given sort of the premiums, I think it was like a 7% premium-ish, somewhere in that area?
Yeah, I think so.
How are we thinking about sizing our needs? Are we going to size, do we want to size the net proceeds to our needs?
Yeah, so you authorized roughly 33 million of bonding, and if we get a significant premium, I want to say he was projecting about 2 million. We would resize the bond so that the total production is right around that 33 million. Any premium that we get on the bands, we can do what we did this year, which was put it in the debt service fund and then count it as a revenue to offset the debt service in the 25 budget.
So on the bonding, if you will, sort of, we're going to be targeting whatever, like that 33 million in proceeds, all
Right.
of which will go into the HHR account.
And some other small projects that you authorize some bonding for,
Okay.
but the vast majority of it is HHR.
Okay. And then the interest that's coming due on the existing bands will be paid out of?
Will be paid out of the proceeds that were the 49 million that we're issuing as bands. So we'll get the money in, we'll pay off what we owe, as well as the debt service that we budgeted for. And then we'll have a fresh year of bands.
So our new bands for, let's just call it the second half of Great Island, we're paying off the interest on the first set of bands for Great Island and the first set of bands
Yes.
for?
Well, your budget is paying off the interest, because we budgeted for the interest offset by the $900,000 premium.
Oh, premium,
for the
okay.
bands.
But we've effectively paid for that with bond proceeds.
Right.
So just make sure everyone's kind of comfortable or aware, I guess, of that. I would almost say we've capitalized
Yes.
the interest on the first 12 months that we had the bands outstanding for HHR, of which I think we've used a relatively small amount of it, right?
Very small, because we expected to already be, you know, a third into a project at this point, and we would have already spent $25 million, and
Right.
I think we've only spent less than 4 total.
And then the other half of Great Island, we've kind of capitalized that part of the interest. Like, granted, it was I think it was a 2.7% tick on that coupon.
So what was it, do we have, you said Mark had slightly lower rates than originally budgeted. Can you tell us where the bands in particular are?
He did not rerun the bands. He only reran the bonds.
Okay.
So that I cannot answer.
I think the bonds, he had again, indicative of like 3.3.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Versus the bonds that we did last time, which were 3.7.
Right.
So we're sort of 40 basis points lower than.
But, I mean, we can hope and speculate all we want tonight, but we will have
We'll find
the
out.
real numbers.
We'll find out next week.
Before you vote on Tuesday.
It's all good.
Well, we control where interest rates are.
I had no idea.
Don't you have to have a Board of Finance rep?
You're not saying we manipulate the treasury
Jim is
market,
our-
are you?
Jim's going?
You've
Are you
seen
signing-
what?
Are you signing our life away?
Yeah, I'm gonna
again?
sign. Yeah.
I just want to know who was, on the hook for,
Well,
2030.
JP controls the interest rates, right?
that's true.
Anything else on that, on the bonding side?
No. You guys got the press release on the ratings, so still AAA. And then it's been quiet since then. We're just waiting to actually have our bid.
Do you think you'll be able to have, by Thursday, your spreadsheet on the 20% threshold for Moody's?
That is my hope. So I'm finishing up the projection. I have the projection done. I just have to dump it into the summary for you guys. And then my next to-do item is that Moody's methodology and creating something that'll allow us to plug in a potential fund balance contribution and have it flow through and see what the impact is.
Perfect, thank you.
And Jenna, as we think about these other two special appropriations in front of us with the Board of Ed, like the bus, we have the ability, if we wanted, to just stick that right into the capital. We can add that technically
Yes.
into that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you can add, you can reduce to the budget, unlike the RTM, who by charter can only reduce, but you can go either way.
Okay. And I think I sent you all around an additional appropriation regarding some security initiatives.
Yep.
And I think I tagged the time of their, I sent you all like their meeting. I suggest you listen to that sort of 10 to 15 minutes and then read the other memo, which I sent around on a confidential basis. My recommendation would be, I'm going to talk to Jill and Dr. Adley, but we perhaps consider that either next Tuesday or at a later date, just waiting for some feedback from them on some of the details.
Going back to adding things to the budget, didn't we decide that was a bad move timing-wise for the buses? Because the RTM wouldn't.
We can't for the buses because they can't spend the money till July 1st, right?
So.
Right.
Well, we could choose to appropriate it, right?
You can do a special appropriation.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so just remind, like, all dollars out of the general fund will ultimately affect the mill rate, right? If you add up all the dollars of the Board of Selectmen capital, Board of Ed capital, and these two other appropriations, if we use $1 on one appropriation, then it's taking away from another capital project, and it's dollar for dollar with the mill rate. But whatever dollars we do decide to use from the general fund, whether it's 1, 2, 3 million, whatever we sort of deem as appropriate there, we could turn those dollars into a special appropriation to go at the same time as the budget to the RTM.
Right.
And Jack would get up there and sort of ask for their approval to sort of approve it, become effective like 10 days after the RTM meeting rather than July 1.
As long as we remember that part.
And I think we did that last year on maybe a Suburban or a couple other things.
Right, so what we'll do for Tuesday night, because you're not yet certain which direction you want to go on these, we can have a special appropriation request prepared for you. We can put it on the agenda, and then if you change your mind and you decide you're going to put it in the budget, then we just don't have to take action on the special appropriation item.
What you're doing is putting it on the night of the budget as opposed to in the budget.
Correct. It'd be another
Yes.
special
Okay.
appropriation item.
What I think is
Yes,
important to
I just
understand
want
is that the 850 or the 750 has the same impact on our taxpayers
Yes.
as any other $750,000 capital project that we're approving or as part of the budget. So if we can make sure that we're talking about it that way, whether we fund it through a special appropriation or as part of the budget, then I'm indifferent to. And so as long as we're still doing our analysis, including it, right? Versus if we just did it tonight and the fund balance goes down because we've done it that way, then it's kind of divorced from the budget discussion.
I think you can definitely, you'll be able to include it in your budget discussion and have the messaging that way. But ultimately, when people get their tax bills or look at the budget, that's not going to appear as part of what they're seeing when they see the budget. Unless they listen to your discussion, they won't know that there's a connection.
No,
between
I
the two.
understand that, but I just want the people that are paying attention to understand that that 750 is the same as any other 750, whether it's in the budget or otherwise. Because again, we don't have unlimited ability to draw down fund balance, right? So If we use fund balance for that, that means we're not using fund balance for something else, which means that's got to be funded by taxes.
Correct.
That's my point.
Exactly. So the way that you're saying it and the way that I'm understanding it is, if you do 750, I'd actually prefer 760, just so that we're not a little bit over. But if you're doing the 750, and so you didn't spend 750 on 5 other projects, and that 5 other projects become part of the capital for which we're taxing, we're recovering those funds in a different manner.
Right, exactly.
So maybe just to finish up, and David brought up a good point. I know we're a little bit in the middle of, I think, the Board of Ed discussion, but on what Norwalk did and what Stanford did. And effectively, just want to make sure you're all clear with that. And Jen, I will beg her to kind of correct me. But basically, you had, like in the case of Darien, the home values are revalued every 5 years. And so it's like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and now we're 28%. And commercial properties effectively get revalued every year using, I think we call it the income approach, right? So their increase was smaller. And so what Stanford and Norwalk both saw were significant increases in their residential portion of the grand list and smaller increases in the totality of their residential one, which shifted the tax burden over to the residents. So what they did effectively is, if somebody's house went from $1 million to $1.5 million as part of the grand list revaluation, their house would go only to 1.1 the first year, 1.2 the second year, 1.3, right? 1.4,
Yeah,
1.5. And that same commercial property developer whose property maybe went from 10 million to like 10.1 million would only get that increase over 5 years. And so that effectively slows the shifting of the burden from one to the other. My understanding is that Stanford has done that a number of times in the past. And so while past practice doesn't necessarily mean it's a policy, they have done it multiple times before. I don't know that Darien has ever done that.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Our commercial base is this big.
Exactly, so I don't think, it wouldn't have nearly the same impact as it would have
Yeah.
in Norwalk or Stanford.
But to add to that, something we talked about, and I'm going to use some round numbers. If the grand list went up by 26%, and the average residential went up by 29%, then if everything stayed the same, forget the tax increases that we're seeing, those residentials would see a minimum 10% increase in their current tax rate. If your house went up by 32%, you're going to see a 20 to 25% increase in your current tax from this year before you even look at the 7 or 10% that Jim's talking about.
Not necessarily. You have the mill rate times your assessed value. If your assessed value goes up, your mill rate should go down to keep you relatively level.
But if your assessed value has gone up by more than 10%, your own taxes are going to go up in relationship to that as the redistribution occurs. Because I've played with those numbers.
Jack, since you played with them, could you put them on a piece of paper,
Yeah.
please, so that we can see them?
Jen has a great little tab in our budget model, which is grand list detail, which just for sort of a high level, the residential homes, which I think there are 6,800, went from basically 84% of the total grand list after a couple of these deductions and everything to about 86%.
Let me say too, I just got the Board of Assessment Appeals has completed their work, so I just got the memo from Tony today. So that's another update that you'll have in your spreadsheet, but BAA reduced the grand list by about 15 million. And compared to the last 2 revals, in 2018 they reduced 25 million, and in 2014 they reduced 45 million. So I think it's a good indicator that our initial reval has gotten much tighter. But I'll update those numbers, you'll see where the 15 million reduction comes in.
But I think you made a good point, Jim, about using something like a phasing in of the grand list. It seems like a way to sort of gloss over the fact that there's a massive increase in spending, and I don't think that's a good idea at all.
Well, while on average, these actions that they've taken have moved a little bit of the tax burden from the residents, like in totality from residents from the commercial properties, it also takes, if Rob's house is up by 200%, my house is only up by 1%, it's also reallocating between Rob and I. And so when I think about, that's why part of when I think about like this, how this would play out and like the fairness and sort of the equity. And while I think you all saw my State of the Town, there were a fair amount of, when I looked at the quintiles, they were all relatively consistent around that 28 to 30%, 31% increases. Within them, there were some massive swings where folks were up 5% and folks were up 70%. So I think it's a...
That equity argument is why a lot of towns, though they all have the ability to phase in any reval at any time, most have not done so. Because you are benefiting one group by saying, we'll smooth that increase, but you're also smoothing the decrease for others.
Right, right.
Yeah. So, guys, a lot of hard decisions I think we need to think about. It's the Board of Ed is, depending how you look at 75 to 80% if you include debt service of pro-rata debt service of the overall budget, but that does not mean that the Board of Selectmen budget can't be reviewed, right? We're supposed to be sort of looking tightly at all of these, and I think we need to, as a board, a lot of these conversations that we have talking about what's happening with the grand list, what shifting's going on, how much, what's growth versus revaluation. I think it may behoove us to have some conversations with each of the operating boards, maybe even earlier, before when I get up there at 11:30 at night, when everyone's sleeping during the State of the Town, and talk about some of the guidance. It may behoove us to talk earlier, to them, make sure they see, I pointed out a lot, but they see a lot of the pressures that we're seeing from commercial to residential, within the residential sector, all of this stuff that's happening, right? Changes to how we look at grand list. I think everyone needs to be aware because, I may, respectfully disagree with a few of the members of other boards where it's everyone's responsibility, once you're elected, to be delivering, making sure that the right services are being delivered at a responsible sort of tax rate, and that it's ingrained in how all of us, the elected boards and frankly the staff, because they're the ones that do all the real work, I feel like in making this town run, are constantly looking at where can we save, right? Whether it's the school bus appropriation, whether it's Jen spending months and months with a consultant looking through unused phone lines, right? Like this should be part of how, every year, every quarter, how we're looking at stuff.
Can I just follow up on the conversation about the fact that you have to select a particular Board of Selectmen line item to reduce? Ideally, it would be that maybe you would say to the Board of Selectmen, tough budget year, we need to cut $500,000. Please don't cut $500,000, but you come up with a number and you feed it back to the Board of Selectmen and say, you're the ones that do the operations. Tell us where you would like to cut this. But if, because you don't have time, you can't do that, and you have, per the charter and per the state, you have line item control over the town side budget, which means you approve the appropriation for every line item in your budget action. Worst case scenario, you have to cut it from somewhere, you have the transfer process for the Board of Selectmen to come back to you and say, well, you cut $100,000 from Public Works, but really we'd rather offer up $100,000 from somewhere else, so we're requesting just to transfer that budget around. So we can always amend that budget if we don't have time for that discourse with the Board of Selectmen, but ideally, it would be reaching back to the policy board and saying, you know, we gotta make a cut, or where would you like to see it come from?
Hey guys, I spoke to John, and I think, you know, he sat in these seats for, I think, 9 years, right? He said, like, if he needs us to take a look at certain things, I think he listened to he was at our meeting from a week ago, right? But if we need to talk to him about looking for items, he's, you know, he's standing by.
Jen, are you talking about cutting on a, sorry, Dave.
No, go ahead.
Are you talking about cutting, not cutting, but shifting from like a departmental level?
No, so, I mean, you say you wanted to reduce the budget $500,000. It would be tough to do that from one line item, so
Right.
you would have to pick a few places, you'd probably hit capital. But once the budget was approved, if the Board of Selectmen said, actually, that doesn't really work for us because we have these other things going on and we actually don't want the cut there, we want it, you know, we can work with it over here, we can't work with it over there. We have the transfer process to come back through and kind of reconfigure what that budget is.
But we could say 100 from police, 100 from public works.
Well, you would have to pick a
100
line item.
From a certain line item,
Yeah.
and then they could come back after the fact and move the dollars around.
Yeah.
So if you were to do it, I think it's extremely difficult, because it's exactly what we wanted to do 1 years ago. But like, you have hauling right now that's like $400 or $500. So since you have to make the cut to a specific thing, you can say in April, because essentially the RTM is going to fall through, you can say in April, we're going to cut 200,000. There's not 500 in the budget. There's 200,000 that we're cutting out of hauling, which then gives the Board of Selectmen and the departments really 3-4 months, so that by July 1st, they can come back with transfers and say, oh, we're really not taking it out of hauling, but here's the 20 accounts that we are taking it out of, and we're replacing the 200,000 in hauling. That's how you would do it.
Right.
It's extremely clever.
It's a process that we have, and we amend the budget all the time through transfers. So while not ideal, and if we could avoid it, that'd be great, so we can get them in the right places to begin with. If you can't, we can work with it.
Okay.
And just to be sure, revenue opportunities are also in the same bucket, right?
Well, there's not really a transfer process for that, but if
But we can
you-
identify revenue opportunities that we believe the Board of Selectmen should implement.
We can set a
You
revenue
set a
budget.
budget.
Yeah, we can set a
And then it is
revenue
up to them if there's fee changes or something needed.
Okay.
That's their prerogative.
But if you want to talk about grants or other things like that, you guys set that. And what did happen in the first year is that when there was a grant that was denied by, at that time, Governor Malloy, but then the grant was put back in, the RTM can increase or decrease or increase the mill rate to account for revenue. And so there was a discussion, Rob, you should remember with Terry, that we added that back the first year.
Yep.
And I think we adjusted the mill rate by 2% to account for 200 or 400,000 we're getting back. We took 200 back in the budget.
Right.
So at the final time, but that was all agreed by that time Jamie and Jay-Z, myself and F&B. So there is also that opportunity at the end, should any of the grants change.
Right.
Well, Jack, I'll just say in closing here, we're going to wrap things up, is, you know, I joined your meeting last night. I think you're having one again on Monday night coming up here. You know, I would just, you know, tell, like, you and your committee, if you guys have things, right, that you think are important, that you want to have adjusted, right, that you think, what I would really do is implore you to kind of bring those forward, right, to us, so that we can think about, because if you all are thinking like a dollar reduction needs to happen here, and we're targeting an overall mill rate level, well, knowing that that sort of dollar, there's a lot of support to move that dollar out, I think we would want to know that ahead of time, because it could mean taking that dollar out versus another dollar out. So I think
Right.
that feedback sooner
But
is
that's
better.
part of the reason we had the discussion
Yeah.
of, if you have guidance of 5%, 5.5%, 4.5%, here's the dollar amount that you would be reducing the increase. So you're not cutting, you're doing a reduction of the increase, as Jim was saying. So we were looking at that already. I think the other stuff on capital, I'm very happy Dan mentioned the tokening paving, because that was one of the things that we were first looking at also. But it's taking a look at some of this stuff, and Jimmy and I have had some conversations on the $1 million security item.
Yep.
So we are trying to get it to you, and that's part of the reason why we're meeting on the 8th. So I know it's NCAA, but we were able to cut the meeting short. So, but you're all welcome to join to participate in that conversation.
Okay. Well, as soon as if you have anything else, just feed it to us sooner, so that, you know,
Trying to get it to you as quickly as possible.
then the least sort of stuff we're doing on the fly on Tuesday would be great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. No other, thank you, everybody.
Motion?
You got a motion?
Motion?
I'll accept the motion to adjourn. Rob moves, John seconds. All those in favor? Okay.
And Mr.